Okay, welcome back to Kaspar. So they're on the Titanic, which has very sadly hit an iceberg and began to sink. So Johnny Trott and Elizabeth's dad have helped Elizabeth and her mum onto the lifeboat, and Johnny Trott has gone to look for Kaspar. Okay. "I'm going for Kaspar," I said. "I shan't be long." Elizabeth's dad shouted after me to come back, but I ignored him. By now, the decks were crowded with men, all of them corralled by the crew, who had made a human cordon to keep them back as the last of the women and children were being helped into the boats. But there was no pushing, no shoving. I saw among them dozens of my fellow stokers, most of them black with coal dust and all unnaturally quiet. As I pushed my way through them to get back down below, one of them called out to me. "You should be in one of they boats, Johnny lad. You're only a slip of a boy. You're young enough. You've got the right." The gangway was packed with passengers, trying to make their way up onto the deck, some of the older and more infirm still in their nightgowns. One of the sailors, who was trying to help them, tried to stop me going down. "You can't go. There's water coming in everywhere down there. The whole ship's flooding fast." I dodged past him. "Idiot!" he yelled after me. "You blithering idiot! You go down there and you won't come back up again." I ran on. After losing my way in the warren of corridors, I reached the right corridor on deck C, and I knew then that the sailor had been right. The sea water was ankle deep and rising. Hello, Ziggy. You enjoying the story of Kaspar? You need to move, though. You need to move. Oh, bad angle again. Where were we? The seawater was ankle deep and rising all the time. And once I opened the door to number 52, I saw the carpets were already underwater. I looked around me frantically for Kaspar, but I couldn't see him anywhere, not at first. It was Kaspar himself who told me where he was, yowling at me from the top of the wardrobe. I looked around for the picnic basket to carry him in, but I couldn't find it, so I reached up and took him off the wardrobe and held him tight. But then, as I went out, I had the presence of mind to snatch a blanket off the nearest bed. All the way back to the corridor, I was wrapping... Hello, Sandy. So I've got Sandy come to join us now as well. Ziggy. They're clearly enjoying the story of Kaspar. We'll try and carry on. All right, beauties. As I went out, I had the presence of mind to snatch a blanket off the nearest bed. All the way back along the corridor, I was wrapping Kaspar up in the blanket, not against the cold, but to stop him clawing at me. For I knew that even if he wasn't frightened now, he very soon would be. As I ran back down the corridor, I was beginning to realise that the blanket had another use, and a much more essential one too. If no luggage was being allowed in the boats, I reasoned, then they would hardly accept a cat. This was why, by the time I got up on deck, Kaspar was sitting deep inside the blanket, and now he was beginning to yowl. "None of your fuss, please, Kaspar," I whispered to him. "Quiet now and stay quiet. Your life..." Thank you, Sandy. "Your life could depend on it." It's a picture, look. Oh. Picture of Johnny Trott with Kaspar in the blanket. Oh. I pushed my way through the stokers, ducked under the cordon of crewmen, and saw to my great relief that the lifeboat was still hanging there. But then I found my way suddenly blocked by an officer in a peaked cap who grabbed me by my shoulder. "No, you don't, lad. No men allowed in the boats until all the women and children are loaded. I can't let you pass." "You're not a man," someone shouted from behind me. "He's only a kid, can't you see?" All around me, the stokers were suddenly clambering at him to let me through, and they began pushing angrily against the ring of sailors, desperately trying to hold them back. I could see the officer taken by surprise at the sudden rage of the crowd, and he was hesitating. I saw my chance. I'm not going on the boat, I told him. I just went to fetch a blanket. It's for a child, a friend of mine. She'll freeze to death out there without it. I still don't think he'd have let me through if Mr. Stanton hadn't come up at that moment and vouched for me. It's all right. He's my son, he said to the officer, and the blanket's for his sister. I was through. With Mr. Stanton holding me fast around the waist, I leaned across and handed the blanket and the miraculously silent Kaspar into Mrs. Stanton's outstretched arms. Be careful, I told her meaningfully as I could. She knew as she was taking it from me that Kaspar was inside the blanket. She hugged it to her and sat down again in the boat. I could see from the way Elizabeth was smiling up at me that she knew it too. Distress rockets were fired up into the sky, lighting the ocean all around us, lighting too the scattering of little white boats out on the open sea, each of them crammed with women and children. Oh wow, I've got a picture here. Quite bad lighting, see if I can get it closer. That's better. See the little lifeboat? Must have been really frightening. I remember thinking how extraordinarily beautiful it all was, and wondering how something as terrible as this could be so beautiful. On board behind us, the band played on, as Elizabeth's boat was finally lowered into the water. Mr. Stanton and I stood side by side and watched from the railings as it was rowed slowly away. That was a fine and noble thing you did, Johnny, he said, putting his hand on my shoulder. God will guard them. I know it. And for us there'll be a boat along soon enough to take us off. Mr. Lightoller says they've seen the lights of a ship not 5 miles away, the Carpathia. She'll be on her way. So I don't know if I've pronounced that right. The Carpathia, maybe. Carpathia. She'll be on her way. They'll see these rockets for sure. They'll be alongside soon enough. Meanwhile, I think we should help with the women and children, don't you? That was how we busied ourselves for the next hour or so, passing the women and the children onto the boats. I marvel now when I think of it at the courage I whispered. Excuse me. I marvel now when I think of it at the courage I witnessed around me that night. I saw one American lady waiting to get into the boat with her elderly sister, but she was told there was no room. She didn't object or protest in any way, but merely stepped back and said, "Never mind, I will get on a later boat." I never saw her again. I saw no man ever try to push his way into the boats. To a man, they accepted it was perfectly right and proper for women and children to go first. I heard later that some men on the starboard side had tried to rush one of the lifeboats and that shots had to be fired over their heads to drive them back, but I never saw it with my own eyes. There were many heroes that night, but if there was one I remember best, it was Mr. Lightoller. He was everywhere, quietly ensuring the safe loading and launching of the boats, and picking out of the seamen to row each one. I can hear his voice. Even now echoing in my head. "Lower away there, lower away! Are there any more women? Are there any more women?" And I remember one of the waiting men answering him back. I remember, "No more women, officer. There's plenty of men, though, but I don't see plenty of boats." It was something every one of us now had come to realise, that there was hardly any boats left to take the rest of us off, and that many of the lifeboats that remained could not now be launched because of the severe list of the ship. That means the ship sort of tilting far too far to make it easy to get the lifeboats off. So it must have been really scary. When I saw the sea water come washing over the bow and rushing down the deck towards us, I knew our chances of survival were fading fast. Like so many others, I scanned the horizon desperately for the lights of the Carpathia. We were all aware by now that she was the only ship close enough to come to our rescue, but there were no lights to be seen. The Titanic was sinking fast, and we knew now that we were going down with her. Excuse me, Ziggy. We knew now that we were going down with her. With every minute that passed, the list to port was telling us that the end was near. The deck was at such an angle that it was well nigh impossible to keep our footing. So the boat's tilted really far and they're struggling to stay on board. Oh, Ziggy, I'm glad you're here for cuddles. It's not a nice story. No. The Titanic was sinking fast, and we knew now that we were going down with her. With every minute that passed now, the Lister port was telling us that the end was near. The dock was at such an angle that it was well nigh impossible to keep our footing. We heard Mr. Lightiller's voice ringing out, "All passengers to the starboard side!" Oh, excuse me, Ziggy. So that's where Mr. Stanton and I went, slipping and sliding, clutching at each other for support, until we reached the rail on the starboard side and clung on. Let me just get the camera back. Until we reached the rail at the starboard side and clung on. Here we looked out at the sea and waited silently for our end. There was nothing more to be done. "I should like to say," Mr. Stanton said, his hand resting on my shoulder, "that if I am to die tonight, and I cannot die with my family, then I would rather die in your company than any other. You're a fine young man, Johnny Trot." "Will the sea be cold?" I asked him. You bottom out the camera. "I fear so," he replied, "but don't worry. That's all to the good. It will be over very quickly for us both." Oh, God. A bit dramatic, this book. There they are, clinging on. Okay. I know it's a bit of a cliffhanger, but we'll leave it there for now. Okay. Oops, excuse me, Ziggy. Kaspar.